Hi, everyone. Welcome to Elegance Lab. My name is Libby Hoffman, and I would like to share with you the overarching framework of what I'm working on in the world, how it can serve you, and how this framework specifically will most likely continue to transform as the world comes about. So I'd first like to start with a story because this presentation is going to be part scientific, part academic, part emotional, part spiritual. And with all of that, the best word for it really is somewhere between mystical and sci-fi. And a lot of times, those can be seen as opposites. If you are speaking in sci-fi, if you are speaking in mystical language, then you are on the opposite spectrum of being scientific or in touch with reality. And I'd like to invite a breath there and really ask, is that true? Is it true that the mystical, the spiritual, the science fiction, the imagination, the imagined, the made up, is the opposite of truth, is the opposite of fact? Many scientists, many innovators, many social change leaders in all of history speak to the fact that they had to imagine, they had to actually suspend current understandings of reality to stay committed to what they were doing. And in fact, many of them were rejected by the societies that they lived in. When I first decided to call the work that I'm doing Elegance Lab in the fall, I had this fear. And I remember making my short 6-minute intro. And I before I made it, I thought, I can't make something that's going to talk about spirituality and religion and politics and science. And who am I to call something a lab when I don't have a formal lab yet? I feel mindful of showing my regard for science and scientific rigor, and also for showing regard for social scientists and psychologists who've done extraordinary work and the value of a rigorous scientific process. And as a creative being who also just came off of a year of deep emotional transformation through a coaching experience a coaching training rooted in the body that I would never have been educated to believe is formal science. I don't care. I don't care because there's a lived truth that's deeper. And when I think about the spectrum of people that I already serve in my life and that I want to serve, I can feel the polarities. I can feel the ways, even when I first created this framework, I was creating it for someone who, is in the more grounded internal truth, more spiritual lens. And she was like, this feels too scientific. And on the flip side, with my people who are having labs at universities, the word consciousness or even envisioning a self outside of the brain feels out of touch with reality or untrue. But I had the gift this past week or two, in the last 2 weeks, to attend a conference that was built, that collected scientists from all over who are studying things that are on the edge of what's considered science right now. And being in touch with these people and really feeling this overlap of people who care about rigor and process, as well as people who are looking at what is not currently validated as formal science, just gave me so much joy and ease. And I was able to actually produce something that has been hard for me to produce because I typically feel such a sense that these experiences are opposites and that I need to choose. I need to choose the creative, mystical, imaginative, joyful, and even that can be a dichotomy of the spiritual and the creative, or scientific the factual, what can be measured and what can be validated. And within all of this is this question of what gets validated in our culture and in our society, and the need for us to ask ourselves what we do value and validate. With that, I want to introduce the framework that I'm working with right now that very much could change. And I invite you to listen to my voice, listen to my tone, listen to how you feel when you're listening, because there is words and then there is sensations and expressions and lived experience behind the words. And language is just one way that we communicate. With that, I do have a cup of coffee and I'm going to drink this while I do this slideshow so that there can be an element of pause. So I want to start with the recognition of my brother, Dan Hoffman, who passed away at the age of 21. He took his life. And I just want to honor him for a moment and his deep creativity, his deep passion. After he passed, I really spent a lot of time wondering, where do I even get the feeling that I had around him, first of all? And second of all, who else do I even know who's so deeply pursuing spirituality, creativity, self-expression to the degree that he was, that was not an easy answer. And then the third of all that I want to acknowledge is that he was pursuing all of these things. My brother Dan was deeply spiritual, he was deeply artistic, he was deeply creative. And I'll stop my share for a moment. It's once somebody passes, sometimes I think about if he hadn't died by suicide, how we would remember him. And how the fact that he died by suicide shifts how we perceive everything about him and how we perceive our relationship to him. But suicide is an epidemic right now. It is a product of the way that we are able to meet humans where they're at based on how our society operates and based on what we know about the mind. And if you remove for a moment the almost like accusation that suicide becomes, that this person couldn't handle their life, or that they had, on one hand, sometimes we make it totally as if like they had cancer and we should just look at them as a victim of what happened to them. And then another, we can go the other way and say, they were the perpetrator themselves and they took their own life. It's its own conflict, suicide. But if you put it somewhere in the middle, that it was somehow outside of their control and somehow in their control, but that they are inherently connected to our society, then the death of this person who committed suicide is on all of us. And many people repeatedly would say to me at that time, to release and let go of or free myself from shame and guilt. And every suicide survivor, of course, does have to go on, for most of us, have to go on a personal journey of freeing ourselves from that guilt and shame that is associated with the experience. But at the same time, it also, in my opinion, sorry, I'm changing this because the shadows are weird. In my opinion, it's actually also essential that we do hold that obligation, that we do hold that recognition that this person couldn't survive in our society and that it is all of our faults. And that is different. Me saying that it's our fault that my brother is dead and millions of people like him every single year, that is not me saying that his death is Libby Hoffman's fault or the Hoffman family's fault. It's saying that this is he was part of our larger unit. And if we as a whole were taking responsibility for our whole, because right now it's very common to have language about self-responsibility and owning oneself emotions, but we are inherently connected as people. So I believe on the other side of self-responsibility, or the deeper truth of self-responsibility, is responsibility for the whole, which involves all the unnecessary deaths that are taking place, while also owning that there, of course, is complete agency in humans to make choices, but that we also are constructing the conditions in which we're living, and we can create conditions where greater meaning can be made, where greater psychological variety can be held and supported. And then ultimately, in my premise here, that people who are creative are valued and supported, and that we as a culture and society value creativity, integrity, authenticity, and difference more than we value fitting in, imitation, copying, lying for the sake of peace in the society. So when I'm speaking about creative embodiment, this process that I'm bringing forth in the world, I cannot disconnect this process from my own lived experience of a part of myself dying by suicide, because that Dan, my brother, was a part of myself. And I speak this because it's easy to want to disconnect our individuality from the things we are creating. But our individuality is what has contributed to what we are creating. And the more that we can validate and value the individuals through which things are coming forth, while also being able to see that me too, Libby Hoffman, is a part of a collective who's been supported to allow this to come forth. The more we can have clarity is the word that I want to use, a little bit more clarity, as opposed to in the society we live now, where we assume that someone sitting behind a desk or having done research is unbiased, and the work that they're producing is unbiased. My premise here is that the work anyone produces, even scientific work, is inherently biased. And instead of trying to overcome that, we can acknowledge it and work with it. And the purpose is to create a more true lived experience and a more true shared reality. All right, so let me take a sip of this coffee. Elegance Innovation Lab for me also began, there's one other story that I want to share, which is over the last decade, since I had the privilege of going to Haiti with my older sister and working at a school for social work, I've been undergoing a process of deconstructing my faith, my understanding of religion. I've traveled on 5 different continents. I've backpacked alone. I've worked in a nonprofit in a very rural area of South Africa. I lived in DC and worked for the International Development Agency, USAID. I worked in San Francisco in impact investing. I lived in Hawaii. I've worked at dance studios. I've worked at restaurants. I've worked at coffee shops. I worked at MSU with an organization specifically focused on intercultural work. And I've supported several different people in their creative endeavors in writing, in coaching, and in alternative health. And in this time, I've really taken what was a design or creative framework and merged it with my work in fitness and spirituality. And the reason I chose to keep, the reason all of these three words are here, Elegance, Innovation, Lab, is that, let's start with at the end. For me, lab implies process. I value process and I value a level of rigor. My long-term vision is to, here's on the fantastical side, it is to create a school of superhero training. And that to me is about theory and practice. We don't just need superheroes saving. We are all superheroes. We all have innate genius. And we need to be able to see the heroism in every single industry and every single role, including in the valuing of those roles that we don't consider special or fancy, because those are the exact roles that actually keep our world running. So lab for me implies experimentation and process. Innovation, a majorly overly used word, implies newness and creation, and intelligence applied in a new way. And elegance implies artistry, structure, beauty, coherence, cohesion, and creative above that, even though it's called Elegance Innovation Lab, creativity is about the chaos that is necessary for greater cohesion to be realized. All right, with that, I have a vision with Elegance Innovation Lab to expand individual and collective consciousness and action towards greater health, wealth, and well-being. I want to speak to this because part of my journey over the last years has felt very fragmented. Either I'm working in education where the word consciousness is not even validated, or if you're working on formal innovation within the tech sector or even educational sectors where consciousness isn't validated, then again, we're looking at innovation from an outer level rather than an inner level. Or I'm working in the more spiritual and embodied place where there's a rich understanding that the human mind is impacting everything. Our thoughts, our feelings, our emotions, our sensations matter. And then in that world, there can be at times a separation from engaging in the larger social structures and social change work, because what is perceived in that work as structural or social change is perceived as being a victim in the consciousness space, because in the consciousness world, there's this attention toward taking responsibility for yourself and being able to acknowledge your own perceptions. So there creates this unnecessary dichotomy when we need both processes. And the reason that I use the words health, wealth, and well-being is to acknowledge that there is tangible outer shifts that happen when the internal consciousness is activated, awakened, or at work. And that is what we are working toward. At the same time, the consciousness and the expansion of consciousness is ultimately the foundation for those things. But they're inherently connected, and I have this DNA behind to begin to awaken and open to that inherent interconnection. There's a lot of places I just want to speak to right here in the vision. There's a lot of places you can go right now, again, for the spiritual. There's places that you can go for the material. And I'm not witnessing as many places where they're coming together and working together. And a lot of that is because there's not shared language or shared framework. So part of my hope with Elegance Lab is to start to be a hub where there can be some shared frameworks where people who perceive themselves to be working on different spectrums or are seeking language across divides can find that support that they need. Two very tangible examples would be someone who's working in the academic space who wants to include a spiritual, conscious, or energetic approach, but their current department doesn't include that language, that somehow there would be a level of support to think about the translation or the way to include this work in what they do. Another example could be somebody who's working, like this has been very true and common for me, and this is my own approach, which is that I'm working more on the consciousness side, working more with spiritual leaders, working more with people who have that perception of the mind, but they have less of the social structure, vision, and ability, so that this could also be a hub for them to get resources to be able to discuss the overlaps of these things. That, for example, designing an anti-racist business is not the opposite of having a self-responsible business. And it's also a place where new thought could be, where new action could be created, because there is like bridges or forums or places where people can actually come together and connect. And then finally, it's also, as you'll see in the process that I outlined here, there is the vision of working beyond our intellect, that when we are truly working on consciousness in relation to health, wealth, and well-being, that we are not just coming to the table from a state of explanation and intellect, but also from wholeness, and that there is an acknowledgement that at times sitting in silence together is more life-giving and more fruitful than actively planning. That we would start to engage in more creative process together, which is inherently poetic and spiritual. It involves silence, it involves listening. So while there is some organizations who work on both those things, and maybe some who work on the overlaps, my emphasis here is on creatives. We are all creative. I want to say that first of all, and that's part of my mission, to actually help people recognize they are all creative. We are all creative. And I acknowledge that, just like it has been a beautiful journey for me to start to acknowledge and call myself a scientist at times when I always just viewed myself as an artist, that a scientific environment is never going to be the place that is the most comfortable for me. For a lot of people, being in a creative environment is not the most comfortable. It might not be the place that they want to spend, but I do want more people to see themselves as artists. And overall, I group together that I'm supporting artists, innovators, and visionaries, and expanding into their creative authority and actualizing their visions. And so for me, there's this recognition that everyone, even the people who are in formal leadership positions, or in a state of doing formal science, that they also are working from this creative chaos, and they might not have as much permission. I know permission is a tricky word because we give ourselves permission, but we also do exist in social structures that reward and punish us based on our speech. And so, we can acknowledge that people, excuse me, who are in formal positions of authority in society don't have the freedom to be as creatively expressive. And yet it is through giving ourselves that space for creative expression that greater authenticity can show up when we actually are working for others. So I want more people to feel connected to their creative authority, which is actually a pretty chaotic state, and feel safe to let that emerge, because there's such a demand in our culture to be put together. And even in preparation for filming this video, I did a first once over from the state of just my emotional state. And I cried and I was frustrated and I left it all in there. That's a different cut that you can go watch. And I told more stories about my brother and I spoke about my spiritual experience because I needed to get that off and out of my chest. And I have freedom to do that because I'm building my own stuff. And I want to make it a little bit easier for people who might not have that creative process as part of their work to start to engage in that so that more of their authentic energy can come forth. And then by actualizing their visions, this is important for me because right now we live in a state that's very goal focused. And while I do want to see people, especially non-traditional leaders, have the opportunity to meet their grand goals. When we're talking about visions, we are talking about things that are both mystical, both sci-fi oriented, and grounded in reality. And that does take the suspension of believing in the present moment, or the suspension of submission to the present moment. That's what I would say. I would say a lot of us are trapped in submission to society as it is right now, which is humorous because society as it is right now is so rapidly changing. So what are four, and I'll just speak to, since I'm recording this in 2024 and I've been working, like this process has come out of the last decade in particular for me since I was 18. It's the reason that I can actually both look to the next decade and some sense of understanding of the tools I will need, while also being able to say the number one thing that I learned in this decade by sticking with my questions and living a more non-traditional life and going through something that many people my age don't, which is the loss of someone quite similar to them, quite close to them, taking their life, who was a very motivated person, is I can see that the most core capacities needed are things that are not being valued in this moment. So I want to start supporting people now with the tools that I believe will be integral for the next 50 years, but let's start with the next decade and start doing that now. So the first one is embodiment. This is already becoming quite popular. But embodiment is the practice of actually being in truth and in alignment with what you are saying or thinking. And embodiment, I call this specifically my process creative embodiment, because a lot of times embodiment is also referring to engaging with your emotional present state. And so a lot of people, if you go work on embodiment right now, what you will be dealing with is a lot of working on childhood trauma, a lot of working on generational or ancestral trauma, and a lot of maybe proactive environments that want to help you just be able to work with your current emotional fears and transcend them. And it's my belief that the act of being creative actually brings out so much more fears than you've ever experienced. And when we continuously pretend, in my opinion, that our greatest traumas are from the past, we are actually shutting down the realities of feelings that we're experiencing for a future that is coming, which is being felt in the present moment. And so creative embodiment there's space to really validate experiences that have happened prior to your lifetime and in your future that are already starting to be processed through your body. And with that, give you access to the creative soul that is already here, but desiring to be manifested. through you. The second tool, let me take a sip of coffee there, since I know that's a lot. The second tool is creativity. And creativity is going to be needed because creativity is being able to think outside of the box, and every single box of society is shifting from the traditional mental frameworks that we use. For example, the scientific method, our relationship to religion as we now know it, our relationship to standing in our own personal authority, our own wisdom, our own intelligence. We're seeing over and over how traditional intellect alone, when we are in states where we have to act, which climate change and changes in our society are, asking of us, that this requires an ability to not just think, but do. And the act of doing when we are under constraint and pressure is an inherently creative act. And so while creativity is often thought of as a level of artfulness, music or acting or dance, the process that I invoke with Elegance Lab is conscious transformation. And I am going to create a second video about this. But I want to just invoke that the heart of creativity is about becoming more conscious. And conscious transformation and the heart of transformation is something actually becoming something different or new. So there is something inherently spiritual about this process because there is a surrendering into the most transformative force within you, which is inherently the things that hold the highest vibration, the highest frequency. This is the difference between pushing on something or remaking with the exact same materials and actually doing nothing and then navigating what needs to be done. Two quotes and ways to think about this. One is Albert Einstein's quote that if I had an hour to solve a problem, I'd spend 95% of the time understanding the problem and 5% solving it. And the second is something that I learned long ago, which is I am a fidgeter, so I'd always end up knotting things, be it a lanyard that was around my neck or my own hair. And the gut reaction when you have something knotted is to pull to add more pressure because you just want it free. But of course, the more you pull, the more pressure, the tighter that it becomes. And so I began to rewire in my system that when I'm experiencing this knot and when I feel that gut reaction to pull, to breathe and actually move slower. And there's that second quote that the slower you move, the faster you get the result. This is not intuitive, and it's not the way that we are being instructed to act, behave, or create right now. And I hope to serve people by recognizing the interrelationship of these things. So on the mirror reflection, embodiment and creativity in this regard, as I'm presenting them, they're more spiritual, they're more internal processes. And there's a lot of places that you could go for these things, and they would just be taught as kind of personal, emotional processes, almost therapeutic processes. The reason that I pair them with the next two things that I'm going to put is that the real juice, the real joy that gets to come in our future society and in the society that's already here and already coming is that we get to experience our creative evolution in relationship with one another. And this is one of the places that I still have a lot of questions about, because there is if you are a highly creative person, it is many highly creative people want to be in isolation because that's when they thrive. And there's a lot of spaces where being in isolation, if you are highly creative, is helpful. At the same time, there is there is whole new levels of creativity that are going to be birthed through our relationship. And also, there's whole new levels of consciousness that can only really come through our relationship. So, this is where 3 and 4 come. It comes to this relational process of creativity. And when I'm talking about guiding people into their creative embodiment, I am talking about getting you to a state where you are relating, even if, there's a spectrum of introversion and extroversion, a spectrum to which you want to be connected with community or not. It is through our connection that 1 + 1 = 3, that synergetic change happens. The other reason that this is important now is that one of the greatest industries that's growing right now is the personal development industry. And the personal development industry is extremely focused on individual change. And I really want creative embodiment to support the collective development of communities, families, and relationships. So it's really meant to be both a replacement for and adjacent to the personal development industry. I don't want to kick out the personal development industry, because there is a purpose for it, but it's just one step toward us being able to be in our most expanded state. And so this creative embodiment is something that's going to run parallel, but also be a part of a series of things in the next, I would probably say, 2 to 5 decades that supports people toward starting to work together in more conscious ways. So the third thing is connectivity. And I also considered calling this relationship, but I felt that connectivity makes more sense because this can help someone who I'm working with, and an organization included in this as well, to have discernment about where it makes sense to be connected with another thought, idea, place, or process, and when it makes sense to be connected more toward itself internally, and when it makes more sense to be connected to an entire new entity. I want to speak this. I know this, involves the changes in our entire business structure, but the same way that businesses buy out businesses right now, but this is happening for the sake of monetary change, not as much for creative innovation. I believe that more of our collective projects will require different creative minds coming together, both across cities, across nations, across the globe, and then at times breaking apart. And this is going to be inherently connected to leadership structures as well. But it's going to take a real big shift within us around how we perceive ownership of the work that we've done and next steps, and like being a part of a more timeless process as well. Because right now, since we work in such a linear way, it's like, this is my thing, this is my organization, and it's in the long scale probably not that helpful to have so many creative minds doing things in such separate ways. But then we need that individuality for creation, but then there's going to be times where it makes more sense to fuse and come together. So in this, the process that I'm engaging people with is in greater collaboration and also experimentation. And this is important because, everything within justice and equity really goes in here as well. But even within here, experimentation is essential. We are in a great human experiment in coming together. And a lot of learning is going to take place in that process. A lot of compassion is going to be needed, a lot of courage. And we have to be brave enough to not just throw things out when they're not working, because there's going to be a lot of things that don't work the first time. We have to ensure that we don't give up on our bonds just because the ways in which we engaged the first time around were messy, were difficult. The way I envision it is that, the evolution of love marriage is relatively new in the span of human history. And because we see a 60% divorce rate right now, then it could be easy to make some drastic assumptions that love marriage doesn't work, or that marriages are destined to fail. And this is not true, but is true that we don't know what we're doing. And as we start to work together as people who are actively striving for true collaboration, we're going to be bringing with us all of our biases, all of our own ways of doing things. And it's going to require deep humility and learning, and also learning about who it makes sense to be working with, when and where and how. So it's a pretty general and big category here, but I include it because 1 and 2 really fall flat without 3. And right now, within the emotional well-being space, within the personal development space, there's a lot of self-reliance. And with that, we lose the vulnerability, the courage, and also the joy and the excitement of opening ourselves to being in connection with others. And this leads to the 4th principle of emergence, which is that something new is actually coming forth. So in the same way that with conscious transformation, these mirror each other. So creative embodiment and collaboration mirror each other. And then conscious transformation and emergence mirror each other here. The same way with conscious transformation, we have to trust the process. Creativity is a lot about trusting the process. It's a lot about beginning and learning along the way. Emergence as well is about, in this process of greater connectivity and experimentation and collaboration, we are, shifting in how we're relating and connecting. And then and then there's a level of trust that something new is coming forth. But we actually want to be oriented toward trying. This goes back to the lab and the practice. And I call this right now the process that I'm working on here, emergent innovation. Emergent innovation for me was grounded initially in learning design thinking. And I worked with several organizations who were adapting design thinking outside of just creating products, but actually how institutions create cultures that are more innovative. And with that comes inherent political questions as well about whose voices get listened to and how. So 3 and 4 really have to be working together in the same way in 1 and 2. If we are not getting connected more to our body, then our creativity is going to be something that's almost always out of us, like we might be imagining without actually being connected to the heart. If we are innovating without being actually connected to relating, then we also create this disconnect. However, if we are actually collaborating and connecting with each other, the innovation is going to come at a new level in a new way. So all of these processes are inherently connected, and the opportunity is for things that have not been done before to get to come forth. I have several other things to speak about here, but I'm going to just let this video close for now. And I would love to ask, if you've made it this far, what is it that resonated? And what is it that you see as a need around you right now? I know these things can sound abstract, but when you look at your own workplace, but also try to zoom out and look at your own industry that you're a part of, look at some of the trends that you've experienced in the last 5 years, 10 years, also as you see the way that we even think, behave, relate and connect and create, evolving and shifting and changing. Like, where are trends that you've seen that are inhibiting creativity and creative process? And what are trends and practices that you see that are opening them up? And how are they directly impacted by the way we connect with our emotions, the way we connect with our bodies, the way we connect with our intuition and consciousness and mind, and the way we connect with each other? And, you know, there's some fundamental questions here, which is, how do we actually build structures that allow for more emergent innovation to be possible? Because the way we actually set plans would need to inherently change, of course, for this to be possible. We would need to let go of a level of predictability. We would need to let go of a level of putting out the metrics before they even happened. And I guess to close, I mentioned that this would be a little bit more mystical than it would scientific, and it got quite processy. So the mysticism here happens in the process. It happens in the time that you give yourself with nature and with people. And the call here is for us to be connected to ourselves and each other, and how those are integral for greater creativity and greater innovation, rather than believing, and I'll get into this in the second slide deck when I'm talking about involution and evolution, but rather than judging the internal process and judging our peers and coworkers who are in internal processes as being the opposite of, or holding us back in the productivity or evolutionary phase, we can start to see that these mirror each other. Greater involution and inner work creates the opportunity for greater outer work to change. Thank you for your time today, and don't hesitate to reach out.